sermon of the day. Let's go to Genesis 13. Sunday nights, we're working our way through, I wouldn't say through Genesis necessarily, but we're going through some of these major characters of the Bible that we would call, the patriarchs, we started with Noah and going to Abraham, and we'll follow that line. So Genesis 13, when you get there, go ahead and stand. I'll read it to you. And Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all in cattle and silver and in gold, and he went on his journeys from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Hai, unto the place of the altar which he had made there at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. And Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents, and the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. And there was a strife between the herdsmen of Abram's cattle and the herdsmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled there in the land. And Abram said unto Lot, let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. And if thou wilt depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent towards Sodom. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. And the Lord said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, lift up now thine eyes, and look from the place where thou art northward, and southward, and eastward and westward, for all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. Arise, walk through the land in the length of it, and in the breadth of it, and I will give it unto thee. Then Abram removed his tent, and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord. All right, we've already prayed, and you can be seated. The title of the message is Seeing the Promised Land Afar Off, and that comes from Hebrews 11, which we'll turn to here in a minute. But when it comes to this, story, this, by the way, is going to go quite a bit with the message I preached this morning, and it seems like sometimes the points of the message, like the final drive of the message, it's so familiar. It's like, oh, we've heard this 1,000 times. And it truly is the message of living the Christian life and following the Lord. And it just like, it's redundant saying the same thing over and over. But you know what? Why we got to meet all the time is because as we live the Christian life, we need somebody to remind us that this is what the Christian life is. And I don't mean to be redundant. I kind of want to preach something different, but every time this is where the message goes. And so that's what we have to preach. So this is very similar. When it comes to seeing the promised land afar off, of course, we're talking about living by faith in the Christian life. And Hebrews, again, makes it very clear that Abraham and his seed never actually get to see these promises that God just made. And some people have a real hard time with that. Some people put a lot of emphasis on these promises to the physical to the physical people of Israel. And, I don't divide with those people. I understand how they get that from some of the passages. But it's my understanding, and I think you'll see this a little bit tonight as well when we get to Hebrews. It's my understanding that all those promises will be fulfilled in the millennial kingdom, okay? Because Abraham never saw that land. His seed never saw that land until many generations later. Yes, some went into the land. At some point, there was a king over the land, and there was different things that happened. But I don't feel like they ever received that according to what they thought God's promise was. They're all kind of symbolic and things, again, that in the New Testament we can look back on those and we can learn from it. But we can also join Abraham in looking afar off into the promised land that is yet to come, okay, the millennial kingdom, what have you. So go ahead and turn to Hebrews 11. A long time ago I preached through Hebrews 11 and went through all these characters based off of that. And so we've kind of looked at this before. And this is what's known as the faith chapter, and goes through all these different characters, some of which we'll be talking about in this series. But it goes and talks about how they moved by faith. Of course, it starts out now. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, and then it begins to talk about these different folks, and it says that, in this passage, without faith, in verse 6, it's impossible to please God. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. He talks about the faith of Noah, who moved to build the ark when God told him to. And then look at verse 8. By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out, not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob. Of course, this is his seed, the seed that comes after him, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which had foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Through faith also Sarah received herself strength and conceived seed, and was delivered of a child when she was past age. We talked about this last week. Because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore sprang there even of one, in him as good as dead, so many as the stars of the sky in multitude, and as the sand which is by the seashore innumerable. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is, an heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. This city, obviously Abraham was right. By journeying into that land, God led him there. God told him, get up from your country and follow me. Go where I tell you to go. And he went there and he obeyed God and he did all that he was supposed to do. Well, he made a few mistakes for sure, but he went into there and he did what God told him to do. He's going to be tested of God in different ways. But what we see is that he was actually looking for this promise that was afar off, okay? And it's interesting, even whenever I'm getting ahead of myself in the series, but even whenever he is told to offer up Isaac, his son, which we know that God put a stop to that. He didn't actually do it. But we see in Hebrews that he apparently just believed God, that God was going to raise him up. God had some kind of plan. If I got to take his life, then God must be going to raise it up because he's the one that was promised to me. And so we're talking about a man of great faith who just followed the Lord. When the Lord told him to do something, he did it. So the first thing that I want to talk about as God's people, continue like Abraham to look afar off at the promises, not necessarily expecting that we're going to receive everything right now, but we look afar off. Here are some things that we need to be doing. And of course, number one is just to follow God. Abraham believed God, it says, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. You know, he was a man who just had faith and did what God told him to do. He was obedient and followed the commands. And, you know, it might seem like, I think about this sometimes like, man, in a way, you might say like it requires more faith today, you know, to follow God than it did in those days. Maybe you feel like that. Sometimes I think, you know, back then they literally would hear a voice from God, or they would see an angel and it would tell them to go here or go there or do whatever. And so you would think like, well, yeah, if I had that today, like if I heard an audible voice, you know, or if I saw a burning bush, if I heard the voice of God, then surely I wouldn't need as much faith. It would be easy to put my faith in that. But you know what's funny about that is there are tons of examples in the Bible where men did hear some kind of voice. They did hear God through, maybe oftentimes it was through a prophet though, or an angel or whatever, but they still would disobey. So many times they would disobey. I mean, think about Jonah. God said, Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh. And he argues with God and he tries to run away from him. Like, I don't understand how that happened when the evidence of everything was so clear to him. But you know what? I don't really feel like their faith was any, like we have any less faith or more faith than they did at any part of time. Because the reality is we have the Word of God. We have all these stories. We've heard all the same things that all these people heard. And we put our faith in God. And like Hebrews says, our faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So it's like you are seeing God. You are seeing things happen through faith. And as you see those, as you grow, your faith is going to grow. But here, and you could go all the way back, and then, you know, all the way up into Jesus, people are watching Jesus, the one that was prophesied through all the Old Testament, and they're watching Jesus, and he's doing miracles, and he's saying, I am the Son of God. And they're like, no, you're not. You're an imposter. You know, he raises up from the dead, and they're like, well, you know, I bet his disciples stole the body. Like, up until the very end, people who are watching this with their very own eyes don't believe it. Okay? So, and then Jesus does say also that blessed are they who believe, who have not seen. And so if you could make the argument that, hey, it takes more faith now than it did back then, well, then you could also make the argument that, well, then there must be greater rewards, you know, because if it does require more faith, then, hey, God's going to bless us abundantly, okay? But the reality is we must, as Christians, follow God, obey His commands, do what He tells us to do. And we might think that, hey, that's not too easy to do. How do I know that's what He's telling me to do? Well, read it in God's Word. Yeah, but, you know, what if I'm wrong? What if there's you know, this doesn't make sense to me or whatever? Just do it. Like Abraham, you think just leaving his country, his hometown where he grew up and all that stuff, and just going to this place where God directed him, having no idea he's just going to be a pilgrim and a stranger. Obviously, he was scared because he makes the mistake of lying about his wife, you know what I mean, being his sister. And so obviously he's scared in this foreign land. And you know, he's going to have his faults, obviously. There is that mistake that he makes with Hagar, that whole situation, which we'll come to. But ultimately, we do see a man of faith, a man who follows God and is seeking to hear from God. Okay, and ultimately, he's looking for a promise that he doesn't know when it's ever going to happen. And of course, we know now he's already dead, but he's not dead, right? Because he's still alive, spiritually speaking, and he's looking for the same thing we're looking for today. We're waiting for these promises, the promised land afar off. Okay, now the second thing as we're looking for that land is this. We have got to learn as Christians to put others before self. And again, this is something I repeat all the time, but it's the Christian life. It's what Jesus said over and over, and it's what we see all throughout the writings of Paul, how we're supposed to put one another above ourselves. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that acronym JOY, Jesus, others, and yourself. I learned that as a little kid, and it's always stuck with me. If we could really do that, I do believe we would have joy in the Lord. If we could put Jesus first in all of our decisions and all of our thoughts, if we would then put others next, after that, and then put ourselves, but usually it's ourselves, others, and then the Lord. That's typically how people think in the flesh. All right, but we need to be able to put others before ourselves. In the story that I read back in Genesis 13, Abraham goes into this land, doesn't know where he takes his nephew with him, Lot. Okay, his brother passes away, and so he takes his son, Lot, with him as if he's raising him himself. Now they're grown. He's all grown up. He has his own tents and herdsmen and servants and all his cattle and all that kind of stuff. And they're dwelling together in this land. I don't know how Lot's faith is. We do know that from the Bible that Lot was a man of faith. He did believe, and he did, he was a saved man, righteous man, the Bible says. But in this case, in this story, it doesn't seem that he makes his decisions based on faith. Okay, all we know is that their land's getting kind of crowded, and all their cattle and their herdsmen are starting to fight, as cowboys kind of do, So they're fighting, and they're saying, "Hey, it's not enough room, and you got my cows or my cattle, and you got whatever the sheep, whatever they're raising," and they begin to fight. And so Abraham comes, and he could have easily come with the attitude like, "Listen, I took you. You're like my son. You need to be in subjection to me. God's the one who spoke to me. I'm the one that God spoke to, and God told me to go to this land." And so he could have taken it upon himself to say, "Hey, this is all about me, Lot." But Abraham knew better. He knew that it wasn't about him. He knew that it was about God, and he's following God. And so he says, "Look, let there not be strife between us." He says in verse 9, "Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee." He says, if thou wilt go to the left hand, I'll go to the right. If you want to go to the right hand, then I'll go to the left. You choose, Lot. I mean, that's a humble man. That's a man putting, this guy that doesn't deserve it, but he's giving him the choice. He's saying, you pick whatever you want. I just don't want there to be strife between us. We're brothers. We are, men of God, and there shouldn't be fighting. There shouldn't be bickering and all this. So he says, you go wherever you want, and I'll take the other way. And this is why he is the patriarch that God chose, because God knew that this is a man of faith. And here's what he was thinking. He's thinking that, whichever way I take, God knows, and God's going to provide, and God's going to bless. It doesn't matter which direction I go. He has this understanding that we as Christians all have to understand. Now, this is a very famous a very popular verse, Romans 8:28. I like to look at it and read it with our eyes because it's so commonly read that it's easy to kind of just gloss over it. Romans 8:28. Now we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. And so we understand as Christians that, whatever situation I find myself, I don't have to think oh no, now it's all messed up. Now everything is wrong. You know what I mean? I'm the one that's supposed to get the blessing. That's thinking selfishly. But if we think about God first, then we know that whatever situation that we end up in, God is in control. God knows what we need. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy 6. And like I said, this goes really well with the sermon this morning. Or this afternoon, I guess. And so 1 Timothy 6, 6 through 8, of course, we're talking about the bread and about being content and with what we have and all that. So look at verse 6. 1 Timothy 6, 6, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. Okay, that doesn't mean you can't lay up treasures in heaven. We can do that all day long, but when we leave, physically, we're not taking anything with us. It's just stuff. And it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. Now, the way it goes with this morning's message is I was talking about the bread, trusting the Lord for our daily bread. And I made reference to the place where he said, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Well, what were those things? He said, don't worry about what you're going to eat or what you're going to drink or what you're going to put on. Interestingly, he didn't even say anything about houses. He didn't say anything about you'll have cattle or you'll have a farmland or he didn't make any promise except for, hey, you're going to be clothed and you're going to be fed. Well, what's he say right here? Having food and raiment, let us therewith be content. The day God stops letting you have any clothes to wear, or he stops letting you have any food to eat, then you can start complaining. Now, that sounds easy. That's really easy for me to say from the pulpit. But look, put myself in that position, I want a whole lot more than just clothes and food, right? I want a place to live. I want peace. I don't want fighting. I don't want persecution. It would be nice to have some shelter, But the point is, we can go through some hard times, and if we have faith, we know, hey, God's on my side, and God's going to get me through this, and he's going to take care of me. I can relax, I can take a deep breath, and I can know that God is in charge. I'm willing to let things go. I'm willing to let somebody else get ahead and me fall behind. I'm willing to do all these things because God is in control, and I'm just living by faith. My promises are far off. I don't need them tomorrow. Look at Philippians chapter 4, another great passage. Philippians 4:11. Funny, just on my way up here, I got a cousin, or I think it would be second cousin, who just had some major health issues and kind of getting his mind back and not even kind of struggling to form some words and sentences. Might even be listening to the sermon tonight, but he's reached out to me and he was telling me how he's doing better with the Lord's help, and he quoted this passage, which I already knew that we were going to look at tonight. And it says in Philippians 4, starting in verse 11, not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. I know both how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. And so that needs to be our mindset. When rough times come, bad situations, we don't have what we want, we lose something, we need to be willing to say, I can get through this through Christ which strengthens me. I can be content in this time through Christ which strengthens me. Or maybe, as Paul's saying, maybe it's a time where you're blessed. I use the word blessed as we normally use it, but you're blessed with great substances and great happiness, and everything in your world seems to be going just perfect. Well, you need to put your focus on Christ too, and know that all things work together for good, and that you can do it through Christ. You can get through this, because guess what? Sometimes having those great privileges actually ends up being somewhat of a curse. Look at Solomon. Okay, here he is blessed with all these riches. Now, at first, he's humble. He's like, I don't need all the riches and all that. I just need some wisdom, and I need to know how to rule these people. And God allows him to have not only the wisdom, but all the wealth and everything that comes with it in the kingdom. He's the greatest kingdom, that's ever been. And sure, it's a great blessing from God. But you know what? That blessing turns into a curse the moment he stops trusting God, and the moment he starts looking at all that he has and dwelling on that and thinking about all he can get and all he can gain, and his heart starts being turned to strange women and to all these different learning and different things that he's wanting to do, he gets carried away. And I believe it's the end of his life that he comes back out of that. But we need to be content in whatever state we're in. Okay, if somebody is just landing in all the situations in life that the majority of people look at and say, like, wow, I wish I had that life. Well, he's so blessed of God. Hey, he's just as blessed as God as the guy that doesn't have anything. And both people still need to rely on God for their needs and for their strength. Okay, so we need to, number one, follow God with all of our heart. Number two, we need to put others before ourselves, because we understand that it's not about us, it's about God, and it's about serving Him. And the final thing is we need to enjoy the present. Okay, and this is what Paul was saying. I can enjoy it. I can be content no matter what state I'm in. You know, the great story, Acts 16, where they're in the jail at Philippi, and the Philippian jailer's there, and he hears them singing these songs, right? They're rejoicing in their bonds. They're chained up. They're in this dark, probably damp and nasty prison, and they're chained up, but they're singing songs to the Lord. They find joy in their salvation, and they know that they're serving God, and that God's going to do great things, which He does. Obviously, He does the miraculous, and ends up a whole family ends up getting saved as a result of it. Now go back to Genesis 13. Now, before we read about this splitting and, Lot go one way and Abraham's going to go the other way, we see where they are. Okay, it says, verse 2, Abraham was very rich in cattle and silver and in gold, and he went on his journeys from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Hai. Go back to chapter 12, verse 8. Guess it's the same page. 12, verse 8. And he removed from thence, this is after God had told him to leave, and he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west, and Hai on the east. And there he built an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. So we see this same place where he is in chapter 13, okay, because he goes off to Egypt for a little while, then he comes out. And the same place that he goes to is this place called Bethel. Now, it's not actually called Bethel until several chapters later, when Jacob calls it that, because he has that dream and he's like, hey, this is the house of God. But the narrator, his reader is already familiar with Bethel, so he's talking about Bethel. Like I said, a few chapters later, we're going to see when it becomes called that. But everybody that's reading it at that time that Moses writes this is going to understand where Bethel is. And so Abraham ends up there. Now, he's not actually in Bethel, but he's in that area, okay, the same area where Jacob later speaks with God. And it becomes kind of a holy place, this region. And the point is, it doesn't really matter where you are. He's not actually in Bethel like Jacob is later on when he calls this the house of God. But he's in this place near Bethel, where Bethel's going to be, and he sets up this altar and he meets with God. So you know what? Where he was the house of God. Where Jacob ends up meeting with God and calling on the Lord is the house of God. And so, we can remember this, that anywhere we are, God's with us, like we're in the house of God, we're in the temple of God. Obviously, in this place we are in Iola, we have a church building and we have meeting together as a church body. And so this is our, house of God. And so we should be able to find joy in that regardless of what goes on in Iola. I'm not against people standing up and for certain laws, or fighting against certain laws, or voting for certain politicians and all that. But at the end of the day, to be quite honest, that's not my fight. That's not even my concern, because God is in charge no matter who's running that, no matter what's going on in our society. Again, I understand wanting the laws to be made so that my family can be safe and all. I'm not against people fighting for that. But what I'm saying is, even if the worst case scenario, If we get everybody always talk about the lesser of two evils. If we get the lesser of the two evils, if we get the worst of the two evils in office, right? And everybody he elects is just like the worst of the worst, and it filters all the way down to Kansas, and then Iowa, and it's just like, oh no, it's doom and gloom. Hey, that happens every election. Every election where the Democrats get the presidency, like all the Republicans are like, oh man, it's the end of the world. What are we going to do? Every time the Republicans get in office, oh, it's the end of the world. We might as well just move to Canada. This is the way that it always is. A Christian should never have to worry about that. I'm not saying don't vote for your favorite guy or the guy that you think will be the best, but pray about it and ask God and know this in your heart, that if God decides to bring us a Nebuchadnezzar, I'm going to still serve God. It's not going to change who I am, because my vision is way out beyond this city. Like, I'm looking for a city not built with hands, eternal in the heavens. The promises are afar off. We've got to remember that. We've got to live in that. But in the meantime, go ahead and enjoy yourself in the Lord. Now, I'm not talking about in the flesh and just being wicked and just doing whatever you want to do, but enjoy yourself in the Lord. Look at let me give you two more verses. Psalm 27. David's a good example of this. And of course, David also was a king who had lots of fame and had lots of money. And there is one point of his term that it seems to really go to his head, in my opinion. But also we see him a very humble man. And at times where people are seeking his life and all this, he might have moments of doubt. He might have fear. But then we read the Psalms and we can see that he would decide. Oftentimes he'd go to a cave or something like that and he'd hide out and he would pray to God and he would decide, okay, you know what? Everything's going to be okay because God is in control. I'm just obeying him. I'm just following him. He's the one that's going to fight this battle. Okay, and here's what he would often say, stuff like this. Psalm 27, verse 4. One thing have I desired of the Lord. Let me see here just a minute. Okay. One thing have I desired of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and inquire in his temple. You know, I've heard it said something like this before, like, I don't want to go this crazy because I realize we're in the flesh right now, and when we get to heaven, like, we'll be in the spirit. But I have heard people say, like, man, if you don't like church service, if you don't like singing the hymns, if you don't like doing all the things, praying and hearing the Bible and stuff like that, well, then you're not going to enjoy heaven. Have you ever heard people say that? Because that's what we're going to be doing in heaven. We're going to be constantly, it's going to be like one big service of God's people. It's going to be a big church service. Well, again, that's not exactly how it works. I understand we're in the flesh and we see things a little differently. But it is true that as a child of God, you can say, like, you know what? I'm the happiest when I put the world out, you know, and get it out of my mind, and I meet with God's people, and I read his word, and I'm hearing the singing, and I'm hearing the preaching, and I'm thinking about these. That's when I have joy in my heart because the promises are afar off, and I see them coming. Chapter 23 is another popular passage where he talks about the Lord is my shepherd. And in verse 6, he says, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. All right, he enjoys where he is. Even in the midst of persecution and many times, even in the midst of all the busyness and all the things we got going in our life, we can stop and have joy in the Lord and just look towards him in obedience, you know, and in recognizing that, hey, we don't want to think of ourselves more highly than we ought. We ought to go ahead and defer to other people and allow other people to have first place over ourselves. And then we can just enjoy the presence of the Lord. Now, real quickly, if you think about this, we won't have to go there and look, but you can kind of remember in your mind, and we'll be talking more about this later. But if you consider the life of Lot, compare that or contrast that to Abraham. Okay, Abraham's like, you know what, Lot, I don't want strife and everything. I tell you what, you choose. You pick whichever one you want. I'll be content with the opposite. Well, Lot kind of takes the opposite approach, if you think about it. Because the right thing to have done probably would have been like, no, you are the elder. You are the one who's been taking care of me. Hey, I wouldn't have any of this if it wasn't for you. And after all, God's the one who's leading you and directing you. You take the first side. So that should have been his attitude, right? But it's more like when you read it, like he's just like, oh, great. Oh, he gave me the first choice. And he looks over into the plains and he's like, man, that would be a wonderful place to raise cattle. And there's lots of water and there's like a nice little city down there. Yeah, they're real sinful people and all this stuff, but it's a nice city. And he's got his eyes on the wrong thing. He's following the desires of his own heart. He's putting himself over his family and his servants. He doesn't stop to think like if this is going to be good for them. He doesn't pray about it that we can see or search the Lord on it. He just says this is the right place to go. And how does the end result? The Bible says that his righteous soul is vexed as he lives in this environment, this wickedness. And these wicked people are just constantly just rubbing off on him, and he ends up in a terrible situation. The next chapter, I think, I remember if it's the next chapter or after, but he ends up, being taken. He's like stolen basically, and he just ends up in all kinds of problems. Eventually, God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah, like basically his hometown, and then he flees into a mountain, and then just does crazy things there, or crazy things happen to him there. His life is miserable, even though he got what he wanted. He went the way that he wanted. We need to think more like Abraham and say, like, God, I'm following you no matter what happens. And so I don't care if I give somebody else the first choice. And how does God end, the rest of the end of the chapter? God says, you know what? I'm blessing you. Look as far as you can to the east, to the west. It's all going to be yours. It's all going to be your seeds. Now, it didn't happen in his lifetime, but he's looking for a promise that's far off. And this is what he saw through the eyes of faith. That's how we need to look. Easy to say, again, sermon after sermon, it seems to be this way, but we've got to get it. We've got to get out of this flesh and out of this the earthly desires that we have, and we got to start thinking about the spiritual promises that are yet to come. All right, let's go to Lord in prayer. Father, thank you once again for your word and for your promises. Help us to understand, yes, you have promised that we'd be blessed even in this life as we walk with you and dwell in your house all the days of our life. And that's an immediate promise as well, we understand. But ultimately, we understand that the greatest promises and the rewards that we await are yet to come. And we do look through as the great cloud of witnesses that have gone before us, Lord, we do look through the eyes of faith at those promises afar off. I pray that you help us to stay dedicated to that and stay faithful to you. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, one more song, and we can go home and sleep.